Eleanor Vane, Duchess of Rothmir, did not scream. She did not weep. She did not look for anywhere to put her hands but where they already were, folded at her waist, over the ring of household keys she had carried for 3 years the way other women carried nothing at all. She unclipped them. One at a time, she set them on the long rent table in front of the whole gathered parish, the cellar key first, then the still room, then the muniment room, until the iron ring lay empty and bright in the September light, and 40 tenants who had come to settle their Michaelmas accounts went very quiet, the way a room goes quiet before rain. "This estate is mine," the Duke had just said to her, in front of all of them. "Mine, madam, not yours to give away." She smiled at him. It was not a happy smile. It was the smile of a woman closing a ledger she had balanced twice, just to be certain. Then she reached into the pocket of her gown, drew out a single folded paper that had lived there, unremarked, for 3 years, and set it in his hand. "Then you had better read what you signed," she said, and walked out of Rothmir Hall into the cold, bright morning, and did not look back to see his face when he opened it. By the time the frost came to the county that year, the Duke of Rothmir would have learnt the difference between owning a house and being owed a marriage, and he would have learned it entirely from paper, from the particular, patient, devastating arithmetic of a woman who did not raise her voice because she had never needed to. The trouble had not begun that morning. It had begun 3 years before, in the particular quiet of a marriage arranged over ledgers instead of letters. Eleanor Hale had come to Rothmir at 22, with a dowry so large it had embarrassed both families into pretending it was smaller, and a father, Thomas Hale, who had built a wool fortune out of nothing and trusted nothing that was not written down. When the old Duke, Edmund Vane, found himself owing more than Rothmir's rents could ever cover, and when his son Julian was of an age to marry, Thomas Hale did not simply hand over money. He hired a solicitor named Aldous Prynne and had him draft a settlement, the Hale settlement the family would come to call it, though only 3 people ever read it closely, that gave Eleanor, and Eleanor alone, the life interest in 3 specific farms: Fletcher's, Combe, and Alder, along with £6,000 set aside for their improvement, answerable to no steward and no husband. A woman ought to have ground under her that no man's temper can move, Thomas Hale had told his daughter, the week before she married, in the flat voice he used for things he meant absolutely. "I will not have you kept the way a good coat is kept. Useful, convenient, and put away when it does not suit." He died 8 months into her marriage, of a fever that took him quickly and without ceremony, and Eleanor filed that sentence away with the others, in the same quiet place she filed most things. The marriage itself was not cruel. That was the particular difficulty of it. Julian Vane was not unkind to her. He was simply absent in the specific way of a man who has decided, long before he ever met her, that a wife is a fixture to be managed rather than a person to be known. He was courteous at breakfast. He was correct at dinner. He handed the running of Rothmir's accounts to his steward, a Mr. Grimsby, and handed the running of Rothmir's house to Eleanor, and considered both arrangements settled, the way a man considers a door settled once he has closed it. What he did not know, because he had never once asked, and she had never once been asked to explain herself, was that Eleanor had spent 3 years quietly doing the work of both. She corrected Grimsby's arithmetic before it reached the Duke. She negotiated with the wool factors herself, under Grimsby's name, because the estate's income depended on cloth contracts her own father's trade had taught her better than any steward alive. She walked Fletcher's farm and Combe farm and Elder farm in all weather because they were hers by law, if by nothing else, and she meant to know them. None of this was visible, because it was constant. That was the particular cruelty of invisible work. It never announced itself, and so it was never thanked. Julian, for his part, had reasons of his own for the distance, though he had never spoken them aloud to her. His mother, the Duchess Seraphina, had left Rothmir when he was 12 years old, and she had not left quietly. She had left on the arm of a horse breeder named Sir Barnaby Hoyle, a man who happened to be holding several £1,000s of his father's gambling notes at the time, and the county had talked of nothing else for a year. His father, Edmund, had raised him afterward on a single doctrine, repeated so often it had worn a groove in Julian like water in stone. Affection is a debt that always comes due, and the man who lets a woman become necessary to him is a man handing her the means to ruin him. Julian had built his whole marriage on the strength of never letting that happen again. He had simply never noticed that in refusing to need Eleanor, he had also refused to see her. That summer, a widow named Mrs. Cordelia Fenn came to stay at Rothmir at the invitation of Julian's aunt, Lady Ottoline Vane, who had been Seraphina's oldest friend and had spent 20 years polishing the doctrine of managed marriage into something like scripture. Cordelia was handsome, precise, and always warmest exactly when she wanted something. Her late husband, Captain Fenn, had died at sea 2 years before, leaving debts nobody spoke of, and a note, a genuine one, this time, for £1,100 that the old Duke Edmund had borrowed from the captain, and never repaid before his own death. Cordelia Fenn had come to Rothmir to collect what she was owed. She left within a fortnight, having decided she was owed a great deal more than that. She was clever about it. She did not attack Eleanor directly. She simply began, in small ways, to notice things aloud. A decision Eleanor had made about the tenants that Julian had not been consulted on, a farm account that ran differently than Grimsby's books, a habit of the Duchess's of walking her own land without an escort, as though she owned it rather than merely lived on it. "How industrious you have become," she said to Eleanor once, over tea, meaning something else entirely. "I have always been industrious," Eleanor said. "You have simply only just begun to look." Cordelia smiled and said nothing further. She did not need to. She had already begun writing. And so when Michaelmas came, and the tenants gathered in the long room at Rothmir to settle their quarter accounts, and Cordelia Fenn stood at the Duke's elbow in a gown the colour of good news, Eleanor walked in already knowing, in the particular way a person knows weather before it arrives, that something in the house was going to break that day. She was only wrong about who would be left standing when it finally did. Rent day at Rothmir had always run the same way. The tenants came in order of their holdings, largest to smallest, and settled what they owed, and the Duke, or, in practice, Grimsby, noted it in the great book. And everyone went home by dusk with a full stomach and a lighter debt. That year, the order broke on the very first name. Abel Fletcher stood before the table with his hat in both hands, turning it slowly, the way a man turns something he is ashamed to still be holding. His harvest had failed twice running, first the blight, then the rains that would not stop, and he owed more in arrears than his whole farm was worth in a good year. "I cannot pay the full sum, your grace," he said. "I do not ask for charity, I ask for time." Grimsby opened his mouth to say what stewards always said to men who could not pay, and Eleanor spoke first. "Mister, Fletcher's farm is one of mine," she said quietly to the room. "Under the Hale settlement, I have reviewed his accounts myself. I am reducing his rent by half for this year and next, and forgiving the arrears entirely, as is my right to do. The room went very still. It was the particular stillness of people watching a thing happen that they had not been told was possible. "You had no authority to say that," Grimsby said, flushing, without consulting his grace. "I have every authority to say it," Eleanor said. "The farm is mine to hold. The decision is mine to make. I am telling the room, not asking it. It was Cordelia who turned it." She leaned toward Julian and said, just loud enough to carry, in a voice full of gentle astonishment, "How very modern." A duchess who countermands her husband's steward before his own tenants. I confess I have never seen the like. Julian's jaw did the thing it did when he was cornered by something he did not know how to answer. A small, tight motion, the particular stillness of a man doing arithmetic he dislikes. 40 tenants were watching him decide whether his wife or his authority would win the room, and he chose wrong. "This estate is mine," he said, low and hard, not looking at her, then louder, so the room would hear it too. "Mine, madam, not yours to give away. Whatever paper my father-in-law saw fit to draw up, you will remember whose name is on the deed before you dispose of another man's debt in my hall." Eleanor let 3 full breaths pass before she answered. She had learned long ago to grant herself exactly that much, 3 breaths, no more, for the things that wanted to break her, and then to put the rest away and get on with the work of living. She granted herself the 3 breaths now, standing in front of the whole parish, and then she reached for the drawer of herself where she kept such things and closed it. She unclipped the household keys from her waist. She set them on the table, one by one: cellar, still-room, linen press, muniment room. And the room watched her do it in the particular silence of people who understand, before they can say why, that they are watching something end. Then she took from her pocket the copy of the Heir settlement's 3rd clause, folded soft from 3 years of being carried, and never once needed, and set it in her husband's hand. "Then you had better read what you signed," she said, and smiled, not for him, but for herself, the smile of a woman who has just discovered that the worst thing she feared saying aloud turns out not to frighten her at all, and walked the length of the long room, past Fletcher, past Grimsby, past Cordelia Fenn's carefully arranged astonishment, and out into the yard, where her father's old carriage still stood, because she had never once let it be sold. She did not go far. She went to Hale House, 11 miles south, the modest unentailed property her father had left her outright, which she had visited twice a year and never once needed until now. Nan Tolliver, who had kept house for Thomas Hale for 30 years and had known Eleanor since she was in short skirts, opened the door herself, took one look at her face, and did not ask a single question that did not need an answer that night. "Well," Nan said, "you'd best come in then. There's stew, and there's a fire, and there's no man here to tell either of us what we're allowed to be angry about." "I am not angry," Eleanor said. "I am clear. They are different countries." Nan said, in the tone of a woman who had lived long enough to know that clarity, in a young woman who has just walked out of her own marriage, is usually anger wearing its good coat. "We'll see how long that lasts. Sit down. Eat something. Whatever's broken can wait until morning to be counted." Hale House had not been properly run in a decade. The roof over the west wing leaked. The home farm's tenant, a good man named Josiah Kemp, who traded in wool on his own account besides, had been managing on his own initiative and instinct for years, with no one above him to answer to, and no capital to improve anything. Eleanor gave herself exactly 1 day of stillness, On the second morning she asked Nan for the estate books, all of them, going back 5 years, and read them at the kitchen table until the candle burned down twice. "You could take a room in town," Nan said, watching her. "Live quiet. No one would blame you." "I have £6,000 set aside under my father's settlement for the improvement of land," Eleanor said, not looking up. "It has sat untouched for 3 years, because no one asked me what I wanted to do with it. I find I would like to spend it." She began with the roof, because a house that lets in water cannot hold anything else. Then she went to Josiah Kemp, who received her in his own kitchen with the wary courtesy of a man unused to being consulted by anyone above him, and laid out, in plain terms and real figures, what she proposed: better contracts with the cloth merchants in Milestone, a mill improved instead of merely patched, wages paid a full week sooner than the custom of the county allowed, because a man who is not waiting on his pay works differently than a man who is. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Kemp said, "but I've dealt with Rothmir's factors for 11 years, and I know what they'll give and what they won't." "I am not Rothmir's factor," Eleanor said. "I am the woman who negotiated half of Rothmir's wool contracts for 3 years under another man's name, because no one thought to ask whose figures they actually were. Give me 1 season. If I am wrong, you will have lost nothing but patience." He gave her the season. By the 2nd month the numbers had begun, quietly, undeniably, to prove her right. The way water proves a slope is downhill, not by argument, but simply by which way it runs. Word of it moved through the county the way such things always did, slowly at first, and then all at once, carried on the backs of carters and the tongues of maids who served 2 houses in the same week. It reached Rothmir in fragments that the Duchess had taken the Hale House mill in hand herself. That Kemp's wool was fetching a better price than Rothmir's own. That Fletcher's farm, forgiven its arrears, had brought in its best harvest in 3 years, out of nothing more than a man no longer working under the shadow of a debt he could never climb out from under. Julian heard all of it second-hand, and each report landed in him with a small, unfamiliar weight he did not have a name for yet, though it sat, most nights, exactly where his chest met his collar. He did not go to her. He had opened the paper she'd given him the very night she left, the 3rd clause of a settlement he had signed 3 years before, and never once read past the first page, because his father had told him such papers were his solicitor's business, not his, and had sat with it a long time in the library, alone, understanding for the first time the precise shape of what he had said to her in front of 40 tenants. He put the paper in a drawer. He did not put away what it had told him. Grimsby, meanwhile, had grown careless, and Cordelia Fenn had grown busy. With the Duchess gone from the house, someone was needed to manage its accounts, and Cordelia offered herself for the task with the particular warmth of a woman doing a great favour at no cost to herself whatsoever. Julian, distracted, agreed. It was Peter Doyle, the estate's under-steward, a quiet, careful young man Grimsby had never valued, and Cordelia had never thought to notice, who first observed that the household ledger misses. Fencap did not match the tradesman's own accounts by a margin small enough to overlook once and impossible to overlook twice. He said nothing yet. He simply began, without being asked, to keep a second set of true figures in his own hand, and to wonder who, eventually, might need them. Cordelia, for her part, had begun composing a letter that autumn, one that would take her 3 drafts and a careful study of an old signature to get right, and she wrote it in the particular unhurried confidence of a woman who believes she has already won. The letter Cordelia Fenn produced in late October was not, on its face, an attack. It was worse than that. It was framed as a kindness, a piece of old correspondence, she told Julian, that had come to her by way of a mutual acquaintance of her late husband's, who had once done business with Thomas Hale. "I did not wish to distress you with it," she said, handing it over with exactly the right amount of reluctance. "But I thought you ought to know the whole of what you married into." The letter purported to be from Thomas Hale to the old Duke Edmund, written in the weeks before the wedding. It spoke of the settlement not as a father's protection for his daughter, but as a purchase, of a title, of respectability, of a place in a world that had never had use for wool money until wool money became large enough to demand one. It closed with a line calculated with real precision to land exactly where Julian was softest, keep her occupied and out of the account books, as suits a wife, and you will find her no trouble at all. Julian read it standing by the window, and something in him that had been quietly reassembling itself over 2 months of second-hand reports about her competence went suddenly, sickeningly still. It confirmed, in his father's dead voice and in Thomas Hale's careful hand, the one doctrine he had spent his whole life being taught, that a woman's usefulness and a woman's honesty could never be trusted to travel together. That the Duchess, who had built 2 farms and a mill back to health in 2 months, without asking him for a shilling or a word of praise, might have been doing it all along not for Rothmir, and not for herself, but as the fulfilment of a bargain struck over his head before he was ever old enough to refuse it. He did not go to Eleanor with the letter. He went to his aunt. "Your father always said the mother's blood tells," Lady Otterline said, not unkindly, pouring tea with the steady hand of a woman who has said this particular sentence to this particular young man many times before. Some women are content to be loved, others require a project. "I am very much afraid, Julian, that you have simply married a different flavour of the thing that ruined your father." It was, of course, exactly the wrong thing to say to a man already primed since childhood to believe it. But something in Julian, some small, stubborn, newly restless part of him that had spent 2 months hearing about a woman who forgave debts and improved mills and never once asked to be thanked for it, did not sit as easily with the comparison as it once would have. "She has never asked me for anything," he said slowly, as though testing the words for the first time. "Not money, not attention, not even an apology, until I gave her cause to want one." "Precisely," said his aunt, missing his meaning entirely. "That is how it is done well." He did not answer her. He went back to the library and sat with the letter a long time, and for the first time in his life, instead of simply believing what his family's doctrine told him to believe, he found himself wanting proof. The antagonist's true countermove came a week later, quieter and far more dangerous than any letter. Cordelia, emboldened by how easily the first document had landed, began adjusting the household books in earnest, now that no one above her was watching closely, small sums here. A miscounted delivery there, always careful, always deniable, always leaving just enough of a trail to be blamed, eventually, on the Duchess who had kept the accounts before her. Peter Doyle watched it happen and said nothing to Julian, because Julian had shown no particular interest in listening to an understeward about anything. He said nothing to Cordelia, because a man in his position did not accuse a duke's houseguest of anything without proof strong enough to survive being disbelieved. He wrote to Eleanor instead. It was a short letter, careful and formal, the kind a cautious man writes when he is not yet certain whether he is committing a loyalty or a folly. Your Grace, it read, I have kept true copies of the household accounts since August, alongside those now submitted in your absence. I do not know what use they may be to you, or whether you would wish them at all. I remain, as ever, your servant, Peter Doyle. Eleanor read it twice at the kitchen table at Hale House, with Nan watching her over the rim of a teacup and saying nothing, the way she had learned to say nothing when Eleanor's face did the particular still, considering thing it did before a decision. Well, Nan said finally, that's a paper worth answering, I should think. It is, Eleanor said. But not yet. Whatever is happening at Rothmir is happening slowly, and slow things are best caught in full, not in pieces. She wrote back a single line. Keep them safe, and keep them coming, and tell no one but myself, and return to the mill accounts, and to Fletcher's farm, and to the particular, patient work of building something no one could take from her twice. It was 3 more weeks before the Duke of Rothmir arrived at her door unannounced, on a Thursday in the rain, holding a ring of household keys he had carried in his coat pocket since the day she left, because he had not known where else to put them, and had not been able to make himself throw them away. She did not ask him in immediately. She stood in the doorway of Hale House with the lamp behind her, and looked at him standing wet and uncertain on her step, and felt something in her chest do a small, careful thing that was not quite forgiveness and was not quite anger either. You came a long way to stand in the rain, she said. I have things to say that I could not say in a letter, Julian said. I am not certain I can say them well even now. I have had a great deal of practice at silence, and none at all at this. She let him in. She did not offer him tea, and Nan, watching from the kitchen doorway, did not offer it either, which was its own kind of judgment. He set the keys on her hall table, the same iron ring she had left on the rent table 2 months before. I have carried these since the day you set them down, he said. I do not entirely know why. I told myself it was because someone ought to. I think now it was because I did not want them given to anyone else. They are Rothmir's keys, Eleanor said, not mine. I gave up nothing that day that was not already yours to have back. I read the letter, he said, the one Mrs. Fenn brought me. About your father. About the settlement being a purchase. I believed it, for a time. I am ashamed to say how easily. Something in Eleanor went very still, in the particular way of a person recognizing the shape of an old wound in someone else's hand. My father built a fortune from nothing, so that no daughter of his would ever again have to depend on a man's temper for her safety, she said. He did not buy you a wife. He built me a wall. I am sorry it has taken you 3 years and another woman's forgery to wonder which one it was. Julian did not defend himself. That, more than anything he might have said, was what made her look at him properly for the first time since Michaelmas. I do not ask you to come back tonight, he said. I understand that would be asking you to trust a man on the strength of his being sorry, and I have watched you long enough now, even from a distance, to know you do not deal in strength alone. You deal in proof. Then bring me proof, Eleanor said. Not tonight, and not with words. I do not want your keys back, Julian. I have keys of my own now, and I find I like the weight of them. If you want anything from me, bring me your account books instead. Open them to me the way you never once thought to before. Show me over time. Words are cheap currency in this family. I would like to see whether you have anything else to spend. He left the keys on her table when he went. She did not throw them out, and she did not put them away either. She left them exactly where he had set them, where she would see them each morning, until she had decided what, if anything, they still meant. The books arrived at Hale House 11 days later, by Julian's own hand and not a courier's, the whole of Rothmir's ledgers for the past 2 years, along with a short note that said only, "I do not know what you will find. I would rather you found it than that I went on not looking." Eleanor and Nan cleared the kitchen table and worked through them for 4 days, alongside the true copies Peter Doyle had been quietly sending south since October. What emerged, once the 2 sets of figures were laid side by side, was not subtle once you knew to look for it. Small transpositions, a delivery of linen paid for twice. A factor's account settled at a price no factor in the county would actually have asked. Someone had been moving perhaps £1,100 out of Rothmir's accounts over 4 months, in amounts small enough to be mistaken individually for carelessness. £1,100, Eleanor said slowly, setting down her pen. That is a very particular sum. Is it? Nan said. It is the exact figure, near enough, that Captain Fenn's estate was owed by the old Duke, and never paid. Eleanor sat back. Mrs. Fenn did not come to Rothmir for tea and a Project Nan. She came to collect a debt, and when no one offered to pay it honestly, she decided to collect it herself. She wrote to Aldous Prynne that same evening, her father's old solicitor, precise and incorruptible and utterly unmoved by titles, who had drafted the Hale settlement himself and still held in his strongbox every letter Thomas Hale had ever written concerning it, in his own unmistakable hand. Prynne's reply came within the week, and it settled the matter more completely than Eleanor had dared to hope. He held no letter resembling the one Cordelia had produced, he wrote, and moreover held 3 genuine letters from Thomas Hale that flatly contradicted its sentiments, including one written the very week of the wedding in which Hale had instructed him, in the plainest terms, that the settlement existed precisely so his daughter would never be spoken of as an asset to be managed. I would be glad to present these, and to compare the hand of the forgery to Mr. Hale's own, before anybody that requires convincing, Prynne wrote. I do not believe the comparison will be difficult. Cordelia Fenn, sensing the ground shifting beneath her, though not yet knowing exactly how, moved first. A week before Michaelmas came round again, an anonymous letter began circulating among the better houses of the county, hinting, carefully, deniably, in the particular tone of a woman who knows precisely how far insinuation can travel before it must become accusation, that the Duchess of Rothmir had, during her tenure, keeping the estate's accounts, diverted funds meant for tenant relief into improvements at her own private property. It was, of course, an accusation built from the very crime Cordelia herself had committed, aimed outward before anyone could aim it in. Eleanor read a copy of it at Nan's kitchen table, in the particular quiet of a woman deciding not to be provoked. She has accused me of her own theft, she said, before anyone had the chance to accuse her of it. Will you answer it? Nan asked. I will answer all of it, Eleanor said, at once, and in front of everyone who has heard even a piece of the lie. Send word to Mr. Prynne, send word to Mr. Doyle, and send word to Rothmir that I will attend this year's Michaelmas rent day myself. Michaelmas came round grey and mild, and the long room at Rothmir was fuller than it had been in years, because word had travelled that the Duchess meant to attend, and half the county had found some pretext of business to be there when she did. Eleanor arrived in her own carriage, in a plain dark gown, with no ornament but her father's old signet ring on a ribbon at her throat, and Aldous Prynne beside her, carrying a leather case that he set on the long table, with the unhurried care of a man laying down a winning hand he has no need to rush. Julian stood at the head of the room. Cordelia Fenn stood near him still, in a gown the colour of good news again, though her smile that morning had the particular brightness of something held in place by will alone. "I understand," Eleanor said to the room, once the tenants had settled and the murmuring had quieted, "that there has been a letter circulating this fortnight concerning funds meant for tenant relief and where they went. I should like to settle the question properly, since it concerns my name." "There is no need," Cordelia began, "to make a public matter of what was only ever a private." "There is every need," Eleanor said, "since it was made a public matter the moment it was written for other people's kitchens, instead of said to my face." She turned to Prynne. "Mr. Prynne holds the true accounts of the Hale farms, going back 5 years, alongside Mr. Doyle's true copies of the household ledger since August. I would like them compared, here, to the books currently kept in this house." It took less than 20 minutes. Prynne read figures aloud in his flat, procedural voice, and Doyle, called forward, confirmed each one against his own careful hand, and the discrepancies, 1,100 pounds of them, in transpositions no honest bookkeeper made by accident 4 separate times, stood out against Cordelia's ledger the way a single wrong note stands out in a hymn everyone else in the room knows by heart. "And here," Prynne said, drawing a second paper from his case, "is the letter Mrs. Fenn presented to His Grace in October, purporting to be from the late Mr. Thomas Hale. I have beside it 3 letters in Mr. Hale's genuine hand, held in my office since before this marriage was made. I would invite anyone in this room who can read to compare them." The room did compare them, passing the pages hand to hand in a silence that had its own weight, and the murmur that finally rose was the particular sound of a great many people arriving, all at once, at the same conclusion. It was Josiah Kemp who spoke next, unbidden, his hat in his hands. "I've dealt with the Duchess honest for a year now," he said, "fairer terms than I've had from any house in this county, and never once a figure that didn't match what she promised me." Abel Fletcher stood beside him and said only, "My farm would have gone under this year, if not for her word. I'll say that before anyone who asks." Cordelia Fenn's composure, which had survived the ledgers and nearly survived the letters, did not survive that. Something behind her practised warmth simply went out, the way a fire goes out when the last of the fuel is finally gone, and she stood very still in the middle of a room that had, quietly and completely turned. "You could have been paid the debt honestly," Eleanor said to her, not unkindly, "if you had only asked for it as a debt, instead of taking it as a theft and lending your grief a false name. I do not intend to see you stand before a magistrate, Mrs. Fenn, though I could arrange it easily enough, and we would both know it. I intend instead that you repay what is owed quietly, from your own means, and that you find some other county in which to begin again. That is mercy. I would ask you to notice that it is also a choice, and that I am the one making it. Cordelia left Rothmir before dusk. She did not return. It was Julian who spoke last, once the room had begun to empty, and the last of the tenants had gone home with fuller accounts and lighter hearts than they had come with. He did not address the room. He addressed Eleanor directly, in front of whoever remained to hear it. "I owe you an accounting," he said, not an apology dressed as one. "My mother left when I was 12, on the arm of the man holding my father's debts, and my father spent the rest of his life teaching me that a wife who is allowed to matter is a wife who is one day given the means to ruin you. I built my whole marriage on not needing you, because I had been taught that needing was the same as handing someone a knife. I have since learned that I was simply handing you nothing at all, and calling the empty hand a marriage." "That is an explanation," Eleanor said. "It is not yet an apology. I have found, Julian, that men very often give me one and expect it to cover the cost of the other. Then I am sorry, he said plainly, without ornament. For every year I let you carry this house and this county on your own back, and called it your duty instead of your gift. I am sorry I said the estate was mine in a room full of people, when the truth I have only now understood is that it was never fully mine at all. Not once, not since the day you first walked its farms in the rain because you meant to know them. The room, what was left of it, was very quiet. Lady Ottoline Vane stood near the door, and it was she, unexpectedly, who spoke next, in a voice that had lost its certainty somewhere in the last 20 minutes. I taught him that doctrine, she said to Eleanor, stiffly, as though the words cost her something to produce. I taught it to him because it was taught to me, and because it felt safer than the alternative. I am sorry for the years it cost you both. I do not expect that to mend anything. I only thought it ought to be said plainly, once, by the person who said it first. Eleanor accepted that the way she accepted most things now, without theatre, and without pretending it undid what had already been lived through. Very well, she said. To Julian she said only, You have given me an explanation and now an apology. I will tell you what I require in exchange for considering either of them enough. Name it, he said. All right, Eleanor said. Then we begin there. Her conditions, when she finally set them out, were not many, but she said each one the way she said figures in a ledger, plainly and once. My authority over Fletchers, Combe, and Elder is to be recorded permanently in the estate's own books, not merely in my father's settlement, so that no future steward and no future husband can claim not to have read it. My name is to appear beside yours on every account concerning tenant welfare, not below it, and not omitted from it. Wages at Rothmir are to be paid on the same schedule I have kept at Hale House, a full week ahead of the county's custom, because I have watched what that week does for a man's dignity, and I will not have it withheld here for the sake of tradition. And no decision concerning me is ever again to be made in a room I am not in. All right, Julian said. All right, then, Eleanor said, and for a moment, standing in the wreckage of what had been, that was the whole of the treaty. Rothmir did not become a different house overnight, and Eleanor had not expected it to. What changed, over the months that followed, changed the way frost changes a field, slowly, and then all at once, and never in a way you could point to as the single decisive morning it happened. She did not move back into the hall immediately. She kept Hale House running under Nan's steady hand and Kemp's growing confidence, and she divided her weeks between the two, and Julian, to his credit, never once suggested she ought to choose one over the other, because he had finally understood that the choosing itself was hers to make on her own schedule. The proof came in small units, the way Eleanor had always said it must. A chair, moved without comment from across the estate office to beside her own, so that the account books lay open between them instead of before one and behind the other. Tea poured for her before she had asked for it, because he had finally learned how she liked it. The ledgers themselves, once his alone and hers by concealment, now genuinely shared, her hand and his both in the same columns, corrections made openly instead of quietly upstream of his notice. It is nothing, in any 1 week, Nan observed, visiting Rothmir that winter, and watching the Duke set down his pen to listen properly, while Eleanor finished a sentence about the older farm's drainage. But you'll notice it's the same nothing, every week, and that adds up to something, given time. That is rather the point of it, Eleanor said. There was, in the spring, one relapse, and she had expected there would be. A tenant on the general estate, not one of her 3 farms, but close enough that word of it reached her within the day, came to Julian in some distress over an unexpected debt, and Julian, out of nothing worse than old habit, simply forgave it himself, quietly, without a word to her, the way a man forgives a debt when he has spent his whole life believing that mercy is a private virtue rather than a shared one. Eleanor did not rage at him for it. She simply set down her pen that evening and named the shape of what he'd done. "You made a decision about the running of this estate today," she said, "in a room I was not in. We agreed that would not happen again." Julian was quiet a moment. "Then you are right. I did not think of it as the same thing. It felt like kindness, not concealment." "It is very often both," Eleanor said, "which is exactly why it must be watched for." "I do not doubt your kindness, Julian. I am asking you to build a habit stronger than an old one, and habits are not undone by a single good intention. They are undone by practice." "Then let me practice," he said, and the next week, and every week after that, he brought her the smaller decisions too, the ones he might once have simply made and forgotten, until it ceased to be a discipline, and became, gradually, simply how the house was run. It was on an ordinary evening in early summer, with no occasion attached to it at all, that he said the thing she had been waiting, without quite admitting she was waiting, to hear properly said. "I do not say I love you lightly," Julian told her across the same table where the ledgers now lay open between them every night, "because I have watched you my whole marriage discount words that were not backed by anything. So I will not say it that way. I will say instead that I have been choosing you, deliberately, for months now, in every small decision I have brought to this table instead of making alone. I would choose you tomorrow, and the day after, and I expect to go on choosing you for as long as I am given the chance to." "That," Eleanor said, "is the first sentence you have ever said to me that I did not need to check against a ledger." 2 years passed, in the way that years do once a house has finally stopped holding its breath. Cordelia Fenn had repaid what she owed within the year, quietly and in full, from the sale of what little property remained to her, and had settled at last in a town 2 counties distant, where nobody troubled to ask what had brought her there. Nobody at Rothmir spoke of her often, and when they did it was without heat, the way one speaks of weather that has passed. Peter Doyle was Rothmir's steward now in fact as well as name, Grimsby having been quietly pensioned off the previous autumn once it became clear whose figures the estate actually trusted. Josiah Kemp's mill supplied cloth to 3 counties and had taken on 2 more hands from among Fletcher's own grown sons. Abel Fletcher's farm had not seen an arrear in 2 years, and his daughter was among the first dozen children to attend the small school Eleanor had founded on the older farm that spring, the Hale School. Built with money from the same £6,000 her father had once set aside so that no one could tell his daughter what she was permitted to build. The keys still hung in the front hall at Rothmir, both sets now, the household ring Eleanor had once set down on a rent table in fury, and the smaller ring from Hale House, which she had never given up and never been asked to. Julian had them hung together himself, on the same hook without comment, the week she finally moved her whole household back under Rothmir's roof, because he had come, at last, to understand that a woman did not need to be reduced to one house in order to be trusted with 2. "This estate is mine," he said to her once more, that autumn, standing in the same long room where he had first said it as a wound, watching the tenants file in for a Michaelmas that owed no man anything he could not pay. He said it lightly this time, almost laughing, and then quieter, the way a man finishes a sentence he has been 3 years learning the rest of, because you have never once let me forget that it is also yours. I do not think I would want it any other way now, even if I could have it back. No, Eleanor agreed. I don't imagine you would. The house, that winter, was warm in the particular way of a place that has stopped holding its breath, not loud, not showy, simply unclenched, the way a hand finally opens once it has stopped expecting to be struck. She had stopped asking long before to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to unsee, not by raising her voice, but by keeping better books than anyone who doubted her, and that was not a gift anyone had given her. It was not love that had built it, and it was not anger either. It was work, chosen daily, the way ground is chosen before it is ever called home. Being needed had never once been the same as being loved, but being seen, finally, in full, with every account open and every figure hers to claim, that, she had learned, was not a thing a man could give a woman at all. It was only ever a thing she could give herself, and having done it once, it was not a thing that could be taken from her again.